we're going to turn our attention here to another very important part of the world in West Asia, that is Iran. And we are very, very honored to be joined once again by Mazda Majidi, longtime anti-war activist and an organizer with the Ansar Coalition. Mazda, thanks so much for being back with us.
Hi, Eugene. Hi, Rania. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I want to start with a story that I think probably some people are somewhat confused about. There's some headlines, but not a lot of explanation. That's the tensions between Iran and Pakistan. Both countries have launched missiles into each other's territory, although it's maybe not at each other per se, but into each other's territory. Maybe just explain what's going on here, Mazda, because I think the way it's being presented is that, the countries may be headed towards a bigger conflict.
Yes, it's very inaccurate the way it's being portrayed here in the West. The southeastern region of Iran is the province of Baluchistan, Sistan and Baluchistan, and so is the southwestern region of Pakistan. In both regions, there's an insurgency, a separatist movement, but especially the separatist movement in Iran is supported by U.S. and Israel. Now, this is a region that's very dry, very desert, and the forces there can kind of move in and out of both countries and Afghanistan, which is farther north for that matter, because it's all desert and it's really hard to control the desert. There's very little water, very little population there, and so forth. So what has happened, particularly in the last couple of years, but it really goes back decades, but in Iran, the separatist forces, some of them with ties with Al-Qaeda, many of them with ties or get money from Israel, they launch these operations within Iran. They kill military commanders, including colonels and high-ranking officers. So what transpired recently was that Iran, after years of suggesting to Pakistan to be more adamant about controlling the separatists who are on both sides of the border, but in reality, in the Pakistan's region of Baluchistan, they seem to have a little bit of a freer hand. So Iran targeted some of the places where these separatist forces, either was their kind of militia centers or locations where had some significance for them. And of course, this was a cross-border attack, and Pakistan responded within a few days by targeting, in fact, similar forces, but on the Iranian side of the border. And of course, in this case, Iran protested and so forth. But in reality, this never really represented a deep divide between the two countries on this issue. But because, both countries have common interests when it comes to dealing with the Baluchi separatists. And so, in fact, right after the rocket attack that happened by Pakistan within Iran, in a border town, both countries declared that, we're not going to let this escalate, and both countries have friendly relationships and so forth. So this is not a conflict that has the possibility of becoming an escalating regional conflict.
And of course, the one that does have the possibility of becoming an escalating regional conflict is what's happening with Israel's genocide in Gaza. You have all of these non-state actors, groups like Hezbollah and the Iraqi PMF and the Houthis, as they're called, are Ansar in Yemen. Well, I guess that is kind of the state right now. But all that said, I mean, these are all organizations that are very much organic and indigenous to their areas and consider themselves resistance groups. But you have this portrayal in the US media that actually, like, because Iran is allied with these groups, is partnered with these groups, is actually puppeteering them. They're all just Iranian proxies that answer to the Ayatollah, and that includes Hamas. Hamas is portrayed the same way in US media. And as a result, everything that happens, whether it's Ansar Allah intervening by blocking ships that are heading towards Israel in the Red Sea to try to pressure the end to this genocide with economic consequences, or whether you have this sort of tit-for-tat violence taking place between Hezbollah and the Israelis in South Lebanon, or whether we're talking about the various Iraqi groups firing at American positions in Iraq and Syria, or Hamas fighting the Israelis, all of this is portrayed as Iran's hand. And so people are concerned that this could lead, if it continues, because all these groups are saying, as long as there's a genocide in Gaza, we will continue to hit at American and Israeli targets until the genocide ends. All this is being portrayed wrongly in the American media as Iran, and this could lead to a hot war with Iran. So I'm just curious, what is your take on what I just described, the potential escalation of a broader regional war that everybody's so concerned about, and how it's being portrayed in U.S. media?
Well, you're right, Rania. And I think it's important to talk about this thing of portraying all these resistance forces as simply proxies for Iran. I mean, in a way, you can understand why the U.S. does that, because the forces allied with the U.S. are essentially mercenaries. They don't believe in anything. They don't fight for anything that they believe in. They get money, and there's actually many reports of mercenaries currently being used in Israel in the genocide of Gaza. And so the U.S. kind of assumes that, well, these other forces are the same. But these are but the other component, though, and the other reason that the U.S. wants to look at it like that is just part of Iran versus Israel, Iran versus Saudi Arabia, is to dismiss the authentic, character of these movements. These are movements of people who put their lives on the line for their beliefs. And in particular, I want to emphasize the resistance in Yemen and the solidarity that the Yemenis are showing for Palestine. I mean, Yemen, having gone through 7 years of Saudi bombings and occupation and destruction, poverty levels of about 50%, and the economy in shambles and so forth. I mean, if you told me in mid-October that the Yemenis are going to play a significant role in solidarity with the people of Gaza, I would have laughed like Rania is laughing right now. And it's amazing, how could you be a people in so much hardship, in so much difficulty, disease, starvation, yet make it a priority to show solidarity, not in words, not by making statements, but in action with the people of Gaza. And if we have time, we can talk a little bit more about what those actions are. But the fact is, whether it's Hezbollah in Lebanon, or the Ansar or the Houthis in Yemen, or Hamas, these are genuine resistance movements. We could talk in detail about them and who they get support from, but none of these forces are proxies of Iran or anyone else for that matter. It is a lineup of forces in the region, as you might expect. There's the pro-imperialist, pro-Zionist forces. There's the pro-independence forces. And of course, these states and forces line up, providing support to one another.
No, I think that's a crucially important point, and I'm glad you raised it, because it does feel that is one of the elements that make it difficult for people in the West, especially, to really understand, is they're not understood as political movements. And it seems to me that they're not understood in their proper context, right? As if there has not been this massive U.S. attempt and, British attempt and French attempt going on for, nearly a century now to sort of shape and determine what, who will rule these areas, who cares what the people who live there think, and that there may be a reaction to that. So talk more, if you could, about that point that you raised at the end about who's really supporting these people and what this really represents, because I think there's such a sinister kind of framing put over it in terms of what's going on, that people get confused about who's who and what's what.
Like Yemen in particular, Eugene?
Well, Yemen in particular, but any others you want to comment on as well.
Okay, well, let me start with Yemen. I mean, the people of Yemen, of course, there were, political conflict. It's a country that holds elections. It had a parliament. It has a president. But of course, many difficulties exist. And the biggest difficulty that the Yemenis suffer is Saudi intervention. If you look at a map, Yemen is part of the Arabian Peninsula, and it is the part that has no oil. So there's a vast difference between Yemen and Saudi Arabia in terms of wealth. And when the forces called in the U.S. mainly or in the West as Houthis, it's a political formation called Ansar Allah. When they were beginning to emerge as victorious in the civil conflict in Yemen, Saudi Arabia intervened. It wasn't just Saudi Arabia, it was a coalition of forces led by Saudi Arabia, mostly reactionary Persian Gulf monarchies. And the war lasted for 7 years. Saudi Arabia, taking a page from the US Air Force, bombed schools and mosques and weddings. And, there were a lot of deaths. And of course, the US fully supported them. And especially now, you can see why. I'm saying from the perspective of the imperialists, from the perspective of the reactionary governments in the Persian Gulf, it is very embarrassing today to have the people of Yemen, led by Ansar Allah, providing resistance to Israel and showing solidarity for the people of Gaza, where they have no interest whatsoever. Yemen doesn't have any borders with Israel, is not particularly close to Israel. But one point in geography is that, the waterway, the Gulf of Aden, leading to the Red Sea, goes through a narrow strait called Bab el-Mandab, which is, about 20 miles, and there's even an island in between it. So the ships that provide oil and other supplies to Israel have to go through the Bab el-Mandab. And despite its limited military capabilities, the Yemeni military has decided to target every Israeli ship and every ship headed for Israel with supplies as a way of providing support for the people of Gaza. But basically, whether we're talking about Ansar Allah and the Yemeni people and the Houthis, or we're talking about southern Lebanon or Hezbollah or Hamas, we're talking about movements, very much movements, not proxy forces, not even militaries, although they have militias and they have armed wings, but there are movements for independence against Israeli Zionism and US imperialism. And these are movements that have existed in the region in one form or another ever since the end of World War I and the Sykes-Picot Treaty. And the US can say, and Israel can say whatever they want about Hamas and Hezbollah and so forth. They may even, have successes in repressing them, but resistance itself is not going to go away, no matter how much they do it. And labeling this or that force as a proxy of Iran or another country is not going to change that fact.
Yeah. I mean, it really is such an incredible, mischaracterization that everybody genuinely believes. But I just want to ask you one more thing, and that is, Iran is, you mentioned ideological, right? Like you mentioned the fact that a lot of these other reactionary governments are just mercenaries. They're just in it for money. They're just in it for staying in power. Whereas these groups we're talking about, they sacrifice a lot, right? And they're doing it for something. They're doing it for their sovereignty, for their land, to protect their territory, to protect their people. And with Iran being such an important material supporter of all of that, I'm just curious if you can explain, why does Iran support all of these groups? Why is Iran partnered with all these resistance groups across the region? If you ask, the New York Times, it would be Iran just hates America and wants to make life miserable for America. But can you talk a little bit about Iran's reasoning there?
Well, I think the history of Iran, much like the history of Palestine, is almost never talked about in the West. So it is just they hate Americans, they like to kill people, this kind of stuff. But Iran, of course, went through the 1953 CIA coup. It wasn't a CIA-supported coup. It was a CIA planned and carried out coup. It was the first successful CIA operation in regime change, and they managed to overthrow the democratic government of Mohammad Mossadegh and put in the Shah as an absolute monarch. So from 1953 to 1979, Iran was under, U.S. client, the Shah, and one of the most ruthless dictators in the region, the Savak, Iran's version of the Mossad or the CIA, was known as having the worst. I mean, the UN called it having the worst human rights records on the planet. So when the revolution happened, of course, Iran had already gone through that, and various political groups and movements, there was no doubt as to who was responsible for the 26 years of an extreme dictatorship that they had suffered. It was Iran. Interestingly, one of the things that further solidified the role of Israel for the US was the Iranian Revolution, because the US saw that no matter how many advanced weapons that you provide to right-wing governments, such as that of the Shah, there's always the possibility that the people will rise up and overthrow them. With Israel, there's not that chance, because the very foundation of Israel is based on being a settler state, a colonial state, and hostility to the indigenous people of the region. So now that there's no longer the Shah, I think Israel is even more valuable for the US as a stable outpost in the region, although I must say that stability is now questioned by the uprising of the Palestinians against tremendous odds. While it is hard to even know these things following the US media, the people in the region know what's been happening in the region. And by the way, again, the problem with the solidarity that Hezbollah and Ansar and others are showing, these indigenous forces, these movements are showing with the people of Gaza, is how much the reactionary Arab governments are not doing, are in effect supporting Israel, or at most, making some broad statements while still providing supplies to Israel. If Yemen and the Houthis and Ansar can do so much to disrupt shipping to Israel, imagine if the Arab states, if the Gulf monarchies were serious or semi-serious against doing anything against Israel, imagine how much they could do. And I think that's very, very embarrassing to Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates to see the Houthis, Yemen, with such limited resources doing so much, and them just making periodic statements about, the Israeli approach not being helpful, or some statement to that effect.
Well, before we let you go, I just want to ask you this too, Mazda, picking up on that point. The opposition media, the Iranian opposition media, as you well know, has been since October 7th, filled with stories about how no one in Iran supports Iran backing Palestinians, that everyone thinks it's a waste of money, that no one's doing this. You travel often to Iran. You talk with a lot of people from many different walks of life. How do you respond to those sorts of characterizations?
It is, the opposition, the pro-US, pro-Israel media definitely say that. And that is definitely true about a part of the population. That's the more affluent people in northern Tehran and other cities, to whom support for Palestine is bad. It's a curse word. These people are proud of themselves for stepping on the Palestinian flag. They take out the name tag of a street, Palestine or Palestine street, and they step on it, and they take photos as a sort of a heroic act. But the majority of the Iranian people support the struggle of Palestine. There has been demonstrations in support of Palestine in many, many cities across Iran, in literally hundreds of cities and towns across Iran. Support for the people of Gaza is very strong. And I want to say this, there is very little variation across the region on this point. Yes, there is a sector of the population, the more privileged, that ally themselves with the interest of the imperialists and the colonizers, but the vast majority of the population have nothing but support and solidarity for Palestine. So in that sense, not only is the Islamic Republic not doing anything that's against the wishes of the masses of people, but in fact, they're responding for a demand by the people to support Palestinians in every way that it can.
Mm-hmm. Mazda Majidi, organizer with the Ansar Coalition, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you very much.